Perfect. Hello, everyone, and welcome to session 4D. So today we're going to be talking about how do we explain cloud security concerns, measures, and concepts. So with this particular session, we're going to be looking at exam objectives covered, which would be 1.1, which is how do we, again, going back to cloud principles, fundamentals, how do we explain it? We're also going to be looking at how do we identify cloud network concepts. And we're also going to identify the benefits or solutions of utilizing a cloud service. And finally, we're going to be looking at 4.4, which actually explains security concerns. So we're now going a little bit more into cloud security. We're going to be looking at security concerns, measures, and concepts of cloud operations. So the first I'm going to discuss today is a shared security model. So the definition, what is a shared security model? It is a framework which splits security responsibilities between the cloud service provider, which is CSP, as well as the user or organization. So it divides the responsibilities between cloud service provider and your organization. And what is really good about CSP, which is cloud service providers, is that they are responsible for the security of the cloud. So a lot of companies don't think about the security because the cloud service provider normally assigns that responsibility. So as we're coming, if we can all mute ourselves, thank you. Now, key points when thinking about the shared security models is two things. CSP, which is an acronym. If you see that, you know that is all about cloud service. It's a cloud service provider, and the responsibility of the cloud service provider, or CSP, is the security of the cloud. So this includes infrastructures, it includes software networking and hardware security. When we're now looking at other elements, which is what is the user responsibility or what is the organization responsibility, we're looking at security in the cloud. So that is when the organization is responsible for data, applications, access control, and user configurations. So as you can see, this is a AWS example. Now you see the customer, which is responsibility for security in the cloud, while the cloud service provider, which in this case is Amazon, they have the security of the cloud, not in the cloud. So when we're dealing with kind of what is the organization's responsibility, their responsibility is thinking about how to secure their customer data, being able to configure the platform application and identity, as well as access management. It's also looking at operating systems, network, firewall configurations. The customer, which is organization, is also responsible for three parts. The first part is the client side, which is looking at data encryption and data integrity authentication. Then the second part is server side, which deals with encryption, and that looks at the file system as well as the data. And then the third lens looks at networking, traffic, and protection. So that looks at encryption, integrity, and identity. So when we're looking at software, which is the cloud service provider, that deals with four parts. So when you're looking at software, you're looking at compute, storage, database, and networking. When you're then looking at the infrastructure of the cloud, that deals with regions, availability zones, and edge locations, which is topics that we discussed in the previous session. Now, moving on, today we're going to be talking about security assessment. So we're going to be looking at threats. What is a threat? What is a vulnerability? What is a risk? What is penetration testing, vulnerability scanning, web application scanning, and hardening? And I would say that a great way to think about security assessments is to understand that when we're looking at threat, vulnerability, and risk, that deals with how do we assess the security of the cloud or the security of a data. While when we're looking at penetration testing, vulnerability scanning, web application scanning, and hardening, we're dealing with the overall kind of like security testing and improvement methods that are going to be used. So a great way is threat, vulnerability, and risk deals with how do we assess the likelihood of the security issue or the security concern or the impact of the security concern. While when we're looking at penetration testing, vulnerability scanning, and web application scanning, as well as hardening, we're dealing with security testing and also methods to improve the security. So when we look at threat, vulnerability, and risk, the threat is an activity that let's say you're trying to protect your system against, right? A good way to think about threat is it's an activity or potential activity that can cause harm or damage. Then when we're looking at the examples of what a threat might be, it could be a natural disaster, it could be a human error, it could be malicious disruptions, things around that. So when we're thinking about natural disasters, we're thinking about earthquakes, floods. When we're thinking about human error, we're thinking about malicious disruptions. We're thinking about misconfiguration, data input mistakes, data leakages, things like that. When we are looking at malicious disruptions, we're looking at cyber attacks and malware. Now, when we go into the elements of vulnerability, so vulnerabilities, when the organization has recognized a flaw or weakness in the system that can be exploited. So the key word here when we're looking at vulnerability is that the weakness has been identified, and two, the weakness is something that can be exploited. So examples of that would be software bugs, it would be glitches, it could be unsecured physical spaces, it could be hardware malfunctioning. These are things that are seen as like a vulnerability. And then you have risk. Risk is, the potential for a loss if a vulnerability is exploited by a threat. So a good way to think about it mathematically is threat and vulnerability equals risk. And why does it? It's because a risk occurs when a vulnerability is exploited by a threat. So threat is potential harm, danger. So it's like a potential activity that can cause harm or damage, while the vulnerability is a known weakness that can be exploited. So when the threat exploits the vulnerability, we then see a risk. So vulnerability and threat equals risk is a good way to think about it. So a good definition of a risk is it's the probable negative outcome if a vulnerability is exploited by a threat. So for example, it could be the potential data loss from someone stealing a laptop, for example. Now, a good thing is that identifying risk and vulnerability is extremely important for organizations. And why is they need to identify what these two are to be able to mitigate them and increase the security of the company, especially when they're trying to, one, secure and protect their critical systems, and secondly, protect their critical data. So those two things are extremely important. Now, when we're going into penetration testing, we're now going into the security testing and improvement methods. So penetration testing is an authorized simulation attack, cyber attack on a system to assess its vulnerability. So an ethical hacker would go into organization and they will attempt to either hack the organization in regards to cyber means, or they will try to infiltrate physically into a building. And the idea is by doing this exercise, the organization is able to understand, one, its vulnerability, and two, potential threats that might occur that they may not have considered, and also allows organizations to clearly identify the risks that they have. So I will say key points to think about when we're looking at penetration testing is that an ethical hacker must have the approval of an organization. If they don't have the approval of an organization, it's not ethical hacking, it's hacking and it's illegal. Two is that they have to use tools that will be similar to that of an actual cyber attacker. And thirdly is the outcome is once the penetration testing is done, a comprehensive report on a system outlining these are your weaknesses and outlining these are the recommended actions to be able to mitigate these risks and vulnerabilities that, as a hacker, I've seen, is then generated, and then this allows the organization to be able to improve their security, which is why penetration testing comes under security testing, because it's a security testing, but also falls under improvement methods, because that report that's generated allows the organization to be able to improve its security. So the next one we're looking at is vulnerability scanning. So vulnerability scanning is an automated assessment of systems, and this allows the organization to understand the security weaknesses, because the vulnerability scanning scans the devices to see where the weaknesses are, to see where the vulnerabilities may be. So it checks operating systems, applications, and services for security issues. So, for example, it may highlight a misconfiguration, which again falls under human error that we talked about earlier today. It also deals with, potential missing security patches that might need to be reconsidered and done. So, it's able to detect misconfigured settings and also able to detect unpatched software. So as you can see, the vulnerability scanning software scans and analyzes the system, and the scan result shows you, hey, you need to check this misconfiguration setting that actually is a vulnerability and could be exploited. And also, hey, you have a missing patch at this particular place that you might need to consider as well. So that's a vulnerability scanning, and it goes again because it's testing the security of a company, and it's also allowing the company to improve, which is why it goes hand in hand between security testing and improvement methods. So when we are going to the third one within under security testing and improvement methods, and that is web application scanning. So web application scanning basically scans the site host. So it deals with web applications specifically, and it does a deep dive into a website or a web application, which is like an app, to detect vulnerabilities. Now, the outcome is that by scanning the website components, providing the scan results, it's able to build a thorough model of the site, and is also able to look at the various components of the website and then highlight the potential issues of that website. So it's a great tool, but it focuses specifically on websites and apps. Now, the final one we're going to talk about under the security testing and improvement methods is hardening. And this applies, this applies the best practices in regards to configuration, patches, and tools to system to be able to reduce vulnerability and their associated risk. Why is that? Because hardening is a process of securing a system by looking at, going on forums, going on, for example, NCSC website, what are the best practices from organization, going to the NIST, which is why you see a lot of companies will ask, do you know the NIST framework? Because it's following the best practices. So it's utilizing the best practices, best industry practices, to be able to reduce the vulnerabilities and the risk within your organization. So it looks at things from what are the latest updates, improving the security of your local firewall. Do you have the current operating system, or do you need to upgrade? What is your physical security like? Do you need to improve that? And also, do you need to train your staff, especially now people are working from home and you're in a hybrid environment? What is the physical security considerations around that? What is your security policies within your organization? And also default settings, do you have any configuration issues? Is that something that needs to change? And then SSH connectivity, which deals with your secure socket, I believe. Can't remember it off the top of my head, but again, I think that deals more with websites. So it's again looking at your connectivity around those areas. And I would say that the good thing about hardening is that it allows you to diminish your known vulnerabilities, but also reduce potential risks as well. Now we're going to go into data security. So how do we improve the security of our critical data? So we're going to look at a CIA triad, then we're going to look at encryption, then we're looking at SSH, which is good because I might have said the wrong thing, but I knew it was around websites. RDP, HTTPS, and encryption, as well as data breaches. How do you perform data security? And looking at these different elements, how do we improve security? So the CIA triad is seen as a holy grail of cybersecurity. If you're studying like the CompTIA Security Plus, for example, this would be the first foundational thing that you would be learning. Thank you, Sasha. She said secure shell for safe, secure login access. We're going to talk more about SSH later during this session. But looking at the CIA triad, it's seen as a cornerstone of information security because it allows organizations to ensure data is shielded from threats and unauthorized access. Now, there are going to be different elements. You might hear of the CIA triad, and there's also the AAA method as well. But looking specifically at the CIA triad, it deals with the first one is confidentiality. So that means that you're ensuring that only those who have appropriate permission can access information. So a good way to think about confidentiality is, for example, if you go to work, you have a staff card that allows you into the building. Now that staff card is done as a way to ensure that you as an authorized worker can access the building. Those who do not have a staff pass are not given access to the building. So that's a good way of thinking about confidentiality because it's dealing with how do organizations ensure that only authorized users have access to the data that they have. So another good way of confidentiality is password protecting a file so that only selected individuals can view that file. When we're now looking at the I, which is the integrity, that deals with how do you ensure that data has not been changed unexpectedly. So it's making sure the data remains intact, accurate, and unaltered unless changes are made by an authorized personnel. So when we're looking at this, it's looking at examples can be like a banking system that verifies transactions that haven't been tampered with, for example. Now, when we're looking at the A, which is availability, that deals with ensuring that the data and services are always accessible to those who are authorized to view that data. So that's all about keeping a website online and accessible even during high traffic. Is looking at ways, how do you ensure that that website is accurately protected, but also not only accurately protected, that only those who are authorized to view that information can view the information, that the data hasn't been altered unexpectedly because it's only authorized users that can view and access that information, and that those who are authorized can access that information at any time. That's a good way to think about the CIA triad. So when we're looking at encryption deals with it's a multifaceted protection. That's a good way for me to explain it, in the sense that the encryption ensures the CIA triad. How does it do that? It does that by protecting users from authorized access. It makes sure that the data remains unchanged during a transit, and it validates the origin and source of that data. So I would say that, one of the most common misconceptions when people think about encryption is people associate encryption with confidentiality. So it's like, ensuring that only those who are authorized to view that information can, because if you think about encryption, a lot of the examples you see is that I'm sending information to person B. Now I've encrypted that information with a code, and because person B has the code, they're then able to access that information. Person C, D, E, F won't be able to access the information because they don't have a code. So because encryption works within that style, a lot of people tend to think encryption is about just confidentiality, but actually the integrity is there because encryption does make sure that the information is unchanged during a transit, but also encryption validates the origin and the source of the data, again, feeding into that availability element. So I think looking at it a little bit more deeper, the uses of encryption is it has three main uses. The first use for encryption is data sanitization. So this is when you encrypt on old hard disk drives ensuring that data can't be, retrieved, or offering a digital alternative to a physical destruction, for example. Or it could be cleansing the information. So if you work in government, you know that they have different tiers of documents. Some are secret, some are official secret, and some have like a higher kind of level of security. And based on your security clearance as a staff determines which information that you actually are privy to or are authorized to view. So another element of encryption in regards to how it's being used is integrity assurance. Encryption helps to confirm that data, so like files downloaded from the internet, remains uncorrupted. And then the last one is authentication confirmation, and that is done through digital signatures, because based on encryption principles, it's able to verify the origin of emails or of a web connection. So you're able to know where that information comes from because it's recorded due to the digital signature. So we're now going to go into SSH. I think Sasha alluded to it earlier. So SSH is secure shell. And the purpose of a secure shell or SSH is that it encrypts network administration traffic. So it provides a secure channel for remote command execution and for other secure network services. So it's able to encrypt network administration traffic. Now, when we're looking at RDP, which is remote desktop protocol, it's all about how does it encrypt network administration traffic and offer access to a Windows desktop remotely. So for example, if you're some companies have their own RDP where you log into the system and then you have to log in within a platform. And it's only when you're within that platform that you're able to kind of see the intranet of the organization. That's when RDP can be seen in real life. And then HTTPS. So HTTPS is all about encrypting web traffic, but not only encrypting web traffic, it ensures the confidentiality and integrity of the data exchanged between 1, the web service, and 2, the users. So that's a good way to think about how encryption feeds into SSH, RDP, and HTTPS. So we're now going to look at data breaches. So what is a data breach? A data breach is an unintended, or it could also be a deliberate exposure of data to individuals or entities who aren't authorized to access that data. Now, a key point to remember when you're considering or looking at data breaches is that, one, even with robust and strong security measures, data breaches can still occur, and it's due to various reasons. So it could be because of human error, or the attacks are just too sophisticated and the organization haven't considered certain routes that the attacker might use, or the cyber threat actor can use. It hasn't been considered, and because it's so sophisticated, the organization is not protected against that. So, no organization can be 100% secure. But what they can do is they can implement practices to make sure that they're at least 80-90% secure. So what I will say as well is that having a good thing, which is very important for organizations when thinking about breaches and also thinking about how to protect the organization from data breach, is that the organization needs to have a incident response policy. So this is crucial, and it's crucial because it guides the organization on how to react to data breaches and how to manage and mitigate the potential damages. Another thing that hasn't been included in these slides, but might be good to consider is, a lot of organizations also have insurance. And as part of the insurance, they have to adhere to certain practices as well, which also protects them from data breaches, in the sense that once a data breach has occurred and they need to pay a fine, they're able to pay the fine through the cybersecurity insurance company. But because, insurance is a money business, a lot of insurance company will not want to take an organization with a high risk. So a lot of insurance companies do have a list of checklists on certain procedures that need to be implemented before they can even give somebody an insurance, for example. So that's also another element if we're thinking about data breaches in a contextual and real world. What that looks like is that cyber insurance plays a huge part in that as well. So we're now going to look at application and infrastructure security. So if you remember, I said earlier about the 3 A's of security. We're going to discuss that. We're also going to look at cloud authentication, multi-factor authentication, single sign-on, and also identity federation. So when we are looking at the 3 A's of security, we're looking at authentication, which is how do you prove your identity to a system? So this can be entering a username or password to access your email account, which we all do every day. When we're now looking at authorization, that is how do you dictate what an authenticated user is allowed to do within the system based on permissions. So basically, it's permissions used to control the level of access based on the authenticated identity. Like I said, if you're working in civil service, you would have access to different information based on your security clearance level. So that's also a good way to think about it. But an example is that as an employee, you might have access to certain files on folders that are restricted to the general public, for example. And then the final one of the 3 A's of security is auditing. So that has to do with the monitoring and recording of user activities for security and accountability purposes. So it's an example of that is, when a system may log in the exact date and time that the user logs in, or when a user has downloaded or accessed a certain file. So because it's able to record that specific time, it's a good way to track. And it's a good way to record the user activities for security and accountability purposes as well. So the next one we're going to talk about is cloud authentication. So cloud services, they require authentication. We've already talked about it, especially when we're looking at the CIA triad. It requires authentication. And why is this important? It's important because with the increasing adoption of cloud services, ensuring authorized users can access the cloud resources is paramount, because a lot of organizations are moving large amounts of critical data to the cloud. So it's extremely important for that as well. Shade said, do you think auditing and non-repudiation goes into hand? Yes, it does. It goes into hand because non-repudiation allows you to, so let's say I send an email to somebody. That's non-repudiation because that email, it shows that I'm the one who sent the email. It shows, sometimes you can get the IP address of where that email was sent from. And it also says the date and time in which that email has been sent. So it reduces chances for me to say, oh, I didn't send that email, or it wasn't me that did it, because there's a record of that information that has taken place. And because there's a record, that can be used for auditing, especially when looking at the purposes of it being for security or accountability purposes. So yes, Shade, they do go hand in hand. Hope that helps. So going back to cloud authentication and why it's important, it's, like I said, with a lot of organizations moving more into the cloud, it's extremely important that they have to think about the security of the cloud. Another element that we have to think about is applications. So when we're thinking about applications within the cloud, there are 3 things that we need to consider. The first one is administrators. Administrators need to authenticate before making a system configuration. And why is that? Again, going back to auditing purposes and that kind of audit trail that needs to take place. The second part is employees. Employees need to be able to authenticate to access specific cloud stored data. Going back into our examples of CIA triad, or authorized users, and when we're thinking about setting the permission controls, when we're looking at the AAA of security, that is important. So when we're looking at authorization, that looks to that element that I talked about with employees proving identities to access user data. And the final one is customers. So this is authenticate. How do you authenticate to order a product, to access an account, or to utilize a service on a cloud-based system? So let's say you're buying a dress from ASOS, for example. You would need your username and password. Again, that's the process of you logging into the system to be able to put in your financial data to make a purchase of the dress. So, but for you to be able to do that, you need to prove your identity, which is why you go through the process of registering your name, your email address, your home address, and your credit card or debit card details as well. Now we're going to go into multi-factor authentication. And what is that? So it's a multi-factor authentication is a security system that requires more than one form of authentication to verify a user's identity. And this is important because with sophisticated cyber attacks, I would recommend that everyone at least downloads an authentication app. So I use Microsoft Authentication app. And even when I go to my email and see how many times someone has tried to hack my email, it's paramount that we all have two versions, of that. Another example is with the rising WhatsApp scams, when they call you saying they're part of a group and they tell you to tell them a number that has been sent to your phone because they're trying to take over your account. By having a two-factor or three-factor authentication, it means that it's difficult for them to be able to access your account, and it's easy for you to be able to restore your account when an attack has taken place. Now, the components of a multi-factor authentication is that it focuses on three things. This is also linked into GDPR and data protection when you're looking at the grouping the different types of information that are out there. Deborah, what's Okta? Sorry, I don't know what that particular platform is. Is that an authentication app? Okay. Then if it is, then it probably is. So the components so when you actually group in the different type of data that exists out there is, the first one is what you know. What do you know? So this could be your username and password. The second type of, data or components of multi-factor authentication is, what do you have? So this could be a security token or an OTP. So for example, let's say you're trying to log into your PayPal, it will tell you, is this your number? You say yes. And then it sends a code to your phone that you then use to kind of confirm your identity. That's another form of authentication. Overman says, does this external include data managers? It does to an extent, but it doesn't deal with the authentication aspect, but it deals with you documenting your data that will then be used for authentication later on. So that's how I would separate both. And the third one is your biometrics. It could be your fingerprints, it could be your facial recognition for those who have iPhones or Androids as well. And again, the benefits of this is that it adds an extra layer of security so that if one factor is compromised, an unauthorized user will still need other factors to be able to access your system. So again, it allows you to protect yourself from potential attacks or hacks from cybersecurity threat actors that exist. So we're now going to go into the next one, which is SSO or single sign-on. So what is a single sign-on? A single sign-on is a service that allows the user to access multiple applications with one set of login credentials. So what it does is that it simplifies the user experience and reduces the password fatigue that some of us may have depending on how much platform that we use. And it also minimizes the chances of password related security breaches as well. Now, an example of this is logging into your company's internal portal, which might also give you access to other cloud tools that exist or cloud resources that exist without you needing to log in again because you've already been authorized already. So example here on the screen is authenticating to on-premise network may grant you access to cloud-based services. The cloud-based services will then accept the on-premise authentication process. So it's kind of like works hand in hand because you've been authorized already. It then gives you access to more tools that exist within the cloud. And finally, we are going to talk about identity federation. So identity federation is a system that allows users to use the same identification credentials across multiple systems, even if they are from different organizations or providers. So key points when you're thinking about identity federation is it enables a single sign-on across different platforms and vendors. It also partners with organizations and it partners organizations to mutually recognize and trust each other's authentication mechanisms. So for example, if you're logging, a good way to think about this actually is you'll notice that some platforms require you to log in using your Google email, for example, or your Facebook. So by using your social media identity, for example, let's say Facebook, you're then able to access a platform. You don't need to register because it basically takes the information from the social media or from your Google email and then automatically creates you an account. So that kind of goes in with, logging into third-party websites using your Google or Facebook credentials. That's a good way of thinking about identity federation. So we're now going to, I think the last ones that we are looking at is we're looking at security and network connections. So we're going to be looking at VPNs as well as direct connections. We're also going to be looking at network services, as well as domain name systems, DNS, and firewalls. So when we're looking at VPNs, they are your virtual private network. So I'll say a VPN is a technology that establishes a secure and encrypted connection over the internet between the local network and the remote network or device. Now, this is important, kind of giving a visual example there. And this is important because with encryption, given the vulnerability of network traffic to interception, which is why I never advise anyone to use public Wi-Fi. The encryption ensures that the data remains confidential and unaltered during a transit. Now, VPNs can be set up for remote employees or branches to access the main company's internal network securely, or even from different locations. So a lot of companies tend to use this, especially now that we're all working in a hybrid, model. A lot of companies utilize VPN as a way of protecting the network traffic for their remote workers. So we're now going to move on to the next one, which is direct connections. So what is a direct connection? It is a dedicated network connection directly linking your local infrastructure to a cloud service provider without passing through the public internet. So instead of going through the public internet, it creates a direct connection of the organization to the cloud service provider. Now, why is this important? 3 reasons. The first one is dedication. So the connection is exclusively for the organization, ensuring a better security and reliability of the cloud. The second one is in performance. It supports a higher traffic load due to the dedicated nature of that connection. And then finally is data encryption. Despite, being a direct connection, data remains encrypted for added security. So that's why direct connections are important, especially when we're looking at it in the context of cloud security. So when we're looking at network services, so this is when modern cloud technologies integrate a range of network services and is essential for effective functioning and security of online platforms. So what are the primary technologies that might be used? They might use a DNS, which is a domain name system, or they might use a firewall. And we're going to delve into it a bit deeper as well. So when we're looking at DNS or domain name system, it's all about, a good way to describe it is that it's a hierarchy and a decentralized naming system for devices connected to the internet. So it's able to translate more intuitive domain names to IP addresses, which are numerical labeled assigned to a device. So it provides two things. The first one is human-friendly names. So users can remember azure.microsoft.com, for example, instead of something like 42.55.1113.118. You're less likely to type that. However, by it being name friendly, you're then able to access that website without seeing the numbers. So that's essentially what DNS does. Now, the good thing about it is that DNS databases, they record, they host records of what internet name is associated with what IP address. So, for example, Google has a public DNS server located at IP address 8.8.8.8. So that I would say is like a good example of like a public DNS, but obviously you won't go to 8.8.8.8, you'll go to google.com or google.co.uk. Now, the final one that we're going to look at is firewall. So going here again, I think this is a good way to think about DNS before we go into firewall, which is the next one. So with DNS is the user requesting IP address. So the user wants to go to google.com. So when the user types in that in the URL, it goes to DNS database. The DNS database then returns with an IP address for google.com and sends it back to the user, then addresses the data to the Google web server at the IP address that has been identified. So that, again, is a good way of understanding technically how does this work. Now, finally, when we're looking at firewall filters inbound and outbound network traffic. So it only authorizes traffic and that is permitted through the firewall. So it evaluates traffics by many means, and this is done by, sourcing IP address, looking at an IP address destination, or using communication protocols like HTTPS, SMTP, FTP, and etc. So I would say, going back to firewall, because that was a lot of information, is that firewall, the definition of a firewall, it is a network security device or software that monitors and filters incoming and outgoing network traffic based on an organization's security policy. So its main function are two things. So the first function of a firewall is traffic filtering. This means that the firewall only allows or denies traffic based on various criteria. So it ensures that only legitimate and safe data packets enter or leave the network. The second thing is that it creates a criteria for evaluation. So what is the criteria? It looks at the source and destination of the IP address, and it also utilizes communication protocols as described, such as HTTP, which is web traffic, SMTP, which looks at email, and FTP, which looks at file transfer. And it's just a good way to think about firewall. So FTP traffic is denied, but the HTTP traffic through the firewall is allowed because it fulfills the evaluation criteria that I mentioned. And then the user or the network can then connect to the cloud or to the internet. So remember, firewalls has two functions. The first one is traffic filtering, and the second one is it creates a criteria for evaluation. So those are the elements of those. So the final ones, we're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we're going to go into the recap, and then I'm going to look at a couple of questions. So I'll see you guys soon in 5 minutes. I'm going to resume the recording. So a recap of what we've learned so far. So we've learned what threat is. So threat is what you're protecting against, while vulnerability looks at security weaknesses. When we're looking at risk, it's threats that may exploit vulnerabilities. Remember, threat and vulnerabilities equal risk. And then when we're looking at penetration tests, these are authorized networks attacks. And then when we're looking at hardening attempts, it looks at attempts to mitigate vulnerabilities. And the final one is that data should be categorized as private, public, and sensitive. So another aspect to think about when we're looking at the recap is that the CIA triad is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. The goals of encryption are confidentiality, integrity, and authenticity. We also looked at the 3 A's, which looks at authentication, authorization, and auditing. And we looked at cloud VPN connections and how that can be used when the quantity of a cloud traffic is low. And we also looked at DNS and how it relates to easily remembering names with difficult to remember IP addresses. And then finally, we looked at firewalls and the filter and traffic based on a set of rules.
Sorry, did you say that the 3 A's are another way of looking at the CIA triad?
No, not necessarily. So the 3 A's of security is another way of looking at security.
Okay, so you did say that there was another way of saying the CIA triad. What was that in reference to?
Oh no, I was saying that another element of how it's grouped when looking at security is the 3 A's. So
okay. Okay. All right, thank you.
No worries. So I am now going to rush through these ones, the answers, only because I need to close at 7. So for the next set of questions, they're going to be true or false. So the first one is a single sign-on means that a user remains logged into a system for the entire day. Is that true or false? What do we think?
False.
And everyone is right. Yes, it is false. So SS0 single sign-on does not mean that a user remains logged into the system for an entire day. It means something completely different, which we spoke about earlier. So the next one is domain name systems. DNS is a way of relating easy to remember names with difficult to remember IP address. Is that true or false?
Yes, true.
True. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of people saying true on the... It's true. So like we said, when looking at Google address, it's 8.8.8, but no one's going to remember numbers. Rather, it's easy names for us to remember. So the next one is a firewall traffic filters traffic entering or exiting a network based on where the traffic originates and where the destination is and what type of traffic it is. Is that a true or false? Oh, okay, everyone's saying true. Congratulations, guys. All right. So the next one is the 3 A's are assessment, authentication, and authenticity. Is that true or false? Susie says false.
False. There's no assessment.
That's true. It's authentication, authorization, and auditing. So which of these goals are goals of encryption? Choose 3. A, D, and E. Anyone else? CIA triad. A, D, and E. Okay, you guys are right. It is a CIA triad. Now we're going to move into which of these is the best describes hardening. What do we think? A, B, C, or D?
C.
You're right. It's vulnerability mitigation. And which of the following best describes a threat? A. I'm seeing A, I'm seeing B, I'm seeing A, I'm seeing B. Okay. It's B. What are you protecting against? Because remember, we're looking at things that can cause harm. So which of the following describes a vulnerability? Oh, I'm seeing A. Yes, it's a known security weakness. Congratulations, guys. So which of the following describes a risk? Yeah, I'm seeing D. Yes, threats that may exploit vulnerabilities. Because remember, when we look at it, it's A. Oh, go back. When we look at it, it's threats and vulnerabilities equals risk. So congratulations, everyone. And thank you all for coming for today's session. I'm going to end it here, but you should receive a recording by tomorrow. I think I haven't uploaded the Monday one as well. There will be a session on Wednesday next week with a mentor. Apologies, he couldn't come this week due to a work trip to Rome, but it's definitely a short session to allow you guys to focus on your assignment, which is why the other one was quite heavy. But Monday will be quite intense, so definitely look out for that, because we're going to do the whole spectrum of number 5. And yes, you guys will get the notes as well, like I did with the last ones. But wishing everyone a lovely rest of your evening, and see you guys next week.